Hello, and welcome to the recorded version of our presentation at Innovate 2021, Creating an Equitable Peer Review of Teaching Process in the Department of Engineering Education. We are several people involved in creating the peer review of teaching process in the Engineering Education Department, and we'll start with introductions.
So greetings, I'm Ann Christie. I am a faculty member in the Department of Engineering Education, as well as a faculty member in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering, and finishing out my tour of duty as Assistant Dean for Teaching and Learning for the College of Engineering. Very excited to be part of this pilot program.
Hi, I'm Kay Halisak, Director of the Michael V. Drake Institute for Teaching and Learning and a professor in the Department of English at Ohio State. I was one of the two Drake Institute partners on the project that we're going to be speaking about today.
And my name is Lynn Hall. I am a faculty member in Department of Engineering Education and was one of the people involved in the peer review of teaching committee.
And my name is Jennifer Herman. I'm also a faculty member in the Department of Engineering Education, and I have been co-chairing with Dr. Christie the committee, the Peer Review of Teaching Committee.
So during our presentation, we had two resources available. These are still active QR codes and links. So the slides are available by snapping a picture of this QR code or going to go.osu.edu/beyond-SEI. We also used Google Jamboards as part of our workshop style presentation, and those the Jamboards are available at go.osu.edu/beyond-SEI Jam. So our goals in this session were to share our experiences creating a peer review of teaching process and to also help our session participants think about, brainstorm, and workshop the considerations for building a peer review of teaching process in their home environments. A little bit of background about our process and our goals. So our goal as a department continues to be to transform the teaching evaluation process into a robust, equitable peer review of teaching process that meets the needs of a pretty varied set of departmental stakeholders. As such, we had a few different concerns we wanted to make sure we addressed in our process. So we wanted to create a peer review of teaching process that addressed a few different concerns, the first being bias in student evaluations of instruction, the second being the limitations of a one moment in time teaching evaluation or observation. And also we wanted to be mindful of the workload involved for faculty responsible for conducting teaching observations. So our first concern, obviously, was that there is a significant amount of research that demonstrates bias in the student evaluation of instruction as an instrument. So it is recognized that they are a flawed measure of teaching effectiveness, especially for faculty presenting as female or as a person of color. The research discusses the various ways that students evaluate, often based on or within the context of bias. And so B. Schmidt has a database which is available via link that we'll drop into the chat as part of this. The database Schmidt created shows gender bias and how different instructors are rated described in Rate My Professor based on various factors. So, for example, the graphic on the screen shows the difference across discipline by gender, how professors or when professors are described as genius. Our second concern was that observations of teaching are one really important method of teaching effectiveness, but also are a single data point in time. They do not fully capture everything that happens in a classroom in that one observation. So we wanted to try to create a system that captures more of how an individual teaches. Finally, we wanted to be mindful of the administrative workload required by supervisors conducting observations or annual observations. And for example, our associate chair is responsible for conducting more than 20 annual observations of lecturers and senior lecturers in our department. And our chair is responsible for over 10 annual observations of tenure and clinical faculty. Finally, of course, we, as all faculty, have experienced COVID-19 ramifications, and that also became a concern for our department as we were thinking about how to deliver courses in different environments with different considerations as a result of COVID. And then that, of course, has also changed interactions with students and one another. So we wanted to be mindful of the concerns with COVID and how to continue providing best practices and demonstrating teaching effectiveness in a shifting landscape. So this is an example of the menu overview of options that we've created. And as you can see, this addresses many of the concerns with respect to the different types of peer review of teaching activities faculty in our department can engage in. And they are also, these options are also mindful of the various ranks of our faculty. So to talk with you more about that, I'm going to hand the presentation over to Jennifer Herman, who's going to share our peer review of teaching process with you.
Thank you so much, Lynn. I appreciate that. And could you just hop back to that previous slide really quickly? Yeah, so thank you, Lynn, for showing this. I wanted to emphasize, for those of you who have experience with doing classroom teaching observations, that option is captured under number 10 here. So you'll see that, as Lynn pointed out, we have 17 different options, and these are all different ways that faculty can enhance and develop their teaching, that classroom teaching observation being one of these 17 different options. So I do want to walk you through now our process that we went through to develop this menu of options. Nick. Yeah, thank you, Lynn. So when we were developing this process, we really wanted to develop a system that would offer faculty multiple varied options that would give them feedback on their teaching, but not just their classroom instruction necessarily. Also their thoughts about putting together their course materials, putting together their syllabus, how they think about the relationship between scholarship of teaching and learning and their own teaching, for example. So we sought to do this by really making sure that as a community, as a department, we knew what our shared definitions were of teaching, of instruction, of teaching enhancement. And we knew we needed to have shared expectations so that all the faculty knew what was expected of them and how it would benefit them. That ties obviously into number 2 here, which is that with a department with over 40 different faculty members, many of whom are lecturers and senior lecturers or associated faculty, your unit or your organization may call them that, as well as practice faculty and tenure track faculty as well. So we had faculty with a variety of needs and a variety of emphases in teaching, right? So some of us who are lecturers, our entire contract is devoted to teaching with a little bit of service perhaps or research, whereas of course tenure track faculty we know have a lot of obligations at an R1 institution like ours to produce research. So teaching development needed to fit into and acknowledge the needs of all those different various stakeholders. Please, the next slide, Lynn. So this is a high-level visual of a process, of the actual process that we developed. And I'm going to walk you through each of these steps in more detail. But this is a process that you could then adapt for your own unit or organization's needs. Of course, all the work in academia gets done via committees. So we began by forming a committee that would be in charge of working with our department, working with other institutional stakeholders and experts to begin researching and leading and defining the process. Of course, once you've got a process, you have to document it. Finally, of course, rubber meets the road with implementation, and then making sure it's doing what you want it to do, assessment. So I'm going to walk through each of these in a little bit more detail. But I wanted to share with you that program success, as far as we've been able to see it in the early stages, we're just actually starting to look at our initial assessment data, is that it's really vital to, one, understand your stakeholder needs. Of course, that's instructors, but other stakeholders as well. To understand their needs around teaching, to think about how your unit, your organization organizes leadership, power, decision-making, and how that will influence your planning and decision-making processes, thinking about your organizational supports that you have, both financial, labor-oriented kind of supports, as well as supports that are part of your institution, such as your teaching development center or something like that. And then finally, how important it is truly to assess your program's goals and how it's meeting or making progress towards meeting those goals. So as I walk through each of those steps, I'm going to try to highlight how each of those four focus areas kind of get enacted. So Lynn, if you could please move to the next slide. So if you had been in our live session, we would have asked you to engage with our brainstorming Jamboard. But what I would like you to do now is pause your video and take a few moments to think about this question that's on the slide here, and to think about it in terms of your particular organization, your particular department or unit. Who are the key stakeholders in that department, and who are the ones especially focused around teaching? So if you can just take a moment to brainstorm, pause the camera for 3 minutes, just jot down some ideas, and then return and push play again, please. And then Lynn, if you could advance to the next slide.
I can also summarize Jamboards from when we did the live workshop.
Yes, why don't we go back to one? I'm sorry, excuse me. Go back to one, and then, yeah, Anne, if you could summarize, please. Thank you.
Right. So assuming you've taken some time to write down who you think your unit's key stakeholders are, let's look at what some of the attendees to the Innovate 21 workshop wrote down. Many of them will no doubt overlap with what you've written down. So faculty, staff, students, and that includes teaching assistants, undergrad teaching assistants, and graduate teaching assistants. But beyond that, your administration, department chairs, associate deans for curriculum, the dean, and your support staff also, specifically your IT staff, your library staff, are also stakeholders in our teaching mission. Alumni, university partners, members of the community might also be folks that we would want to consider when we're thinking about, on a larger sense, who are the key stakeholders for the teaching mission. Employers, And throughout that, having leadership buy-in and consistent messaging, also including those who are part of their research is in the scholarship of teaching and learning. And so those who are learning things and are particularly well plugged into the research literature who have expertise in this. So these are just some of the Jamboard virtual Post-it notes that were shared during the Innovate conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. And yes, by documenting all these stakeholders in advance and kind of jotting down and thinking through their needs and their concerns around peer review of teaching, committees can be proactive and make sure that whatever process gets developed is addressing those needs and being communicated to those people who really need to know. The second question we'd like you to pause and take a moment, 3 minutes or so, to reflect on are to think about your organizational culture, the culture in your department, the culture in your unit or institution, and think about what are the cultural openings, the characteristics of your unit or of your organization that you think would facilitate and be helpful for developing a peer review of teaching process. And then I want you to also think about what are the challenges, what are some of the challenges that you would need to make sure you have in mind as you're thinking about a process that could be adapted and effective for your department. So just take a couple minutes, please now, pause the video, and we'll be back with you.
All right, thank you. Assuming you've jotted down your ideas, let me share some of the ones that your colleagues contributed at the Innovate conference. So let's start with the openings. So building on existing infrastructure, if you already have, as we did, sort of a faculty evaluation committee, or as this person did, maybe peer review of teaching isn't currently part of that committee or that body's charge, but it could be. Another opening that was brainstormed is the chance to make a more equitable process for different types of courses, whether it be differences between undergrad and grad, whether it be different levels of instructor, whether it's a lecture or a lab or a recitation, a computational focused thing. So these are all potential openings for developing this kind of a peer review teaching process. So what were some of the challenges? Challenges, one here listed is individuals with different disciplinary backgrounds. And along with those different disciplinary backgrounds, different embedded assumptions about teaching and how to teach well. Other challenges, requiring tenured faculty to learn a new process and potentially having to invest more time, effort into the activity. And sort of going along with that, the idea of the challenge of holding on to legacy practices and assumptions. And in a more humorous note, someone noted CAVE, colleagues against virtually everything. So again, the challenge being how to establish buy-in to promote academic change, change in an academic unit. But there's a lot of research in that as well. So you're not on your own. There are tools and approaches that will set you up for success, and we encourage you to use those in your local situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, and just being aware that there are those faculty members and thinking about how to integrate them into the process, I think, as well. So the first step in the process, of course, is to actually have a PRT committee. So in our department chair and associate chair decided this is something that our department needs. We need to look at our peer review of teaching process and make it work better for us, do what we want it to do. So members for that committee were actually selected based on interest. So folks who were interested in working on this, and also as well as expertise, folks who had experience with doing observations of classroom teaching and participating in them as well. And one, again, to sort of match the profile of our department, this committee was comprised of faculty and staff as well from different roles and ranks. So again, those associated faculty / lecturers, practice or clinical faculty, tenure track faculty. We did have folks who were faculty and serving in administrative positions, as well as staff. And we've actually now even been joined by graduate student members. And we found that having those different variety of roles and ranks gave us insight into stakeholder needs, but also gave us perspectives on teaching and development and professional development and evaluation that we could consider both from a departmental level as well as a broader institutional level. We had folks who had come up in English departments versus food and ag departments versus mechanical engineering departments. So we had a variety of institutional and disciplinary backgrounds as well, which was valuable for thinking about, again, those folks with concerns about cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary review. Having folks involved in the planning from those different backgrounds can be very helpful as you're forming and thinking about the folks who are going to be on that committee. Lynn, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So once you've got the committee, right, then the work can actually begin. So this was actually a very important process, was defining what you're actually going to be doing as you are preparing the process. So what is the goal? What is the aim? What is the intended outcome of the committee? So to do that, there were several different steps that we proceeded through. But the first one we wanted to do was make sure that our goals and our mission, as we were defining them, were guided by experts in faculty teaching development. So we actually invited the former director of our university Center for the Advancement of Teaching to help us identify and explore stakeholder needs. And it was very valuable to have that outside person come into our department, especially as we started sharing out with our department our initial thinking, because that person was able to guide conversations and didn't have the sort of the relationships, the established relationships that the folks on our committee had with the department. So they were able to give a more objective kind of presentation of the goals of programs like this to help us as a department articulate our shared values around teaching and evaluation. It was really important that we had something in mind when we had those conversations facilitated by that director, because we didn't want to start with a blank slate. We wanted to present options. And through those, we found that a lot of the traits of our culture were able to come through in these conversations. So in our department, we really value teaching expertise. So that person, that director of the University Teaching Center, was a respected individual and their expertise was highly valued. Our department also values students. We're very student-centered, very education-focused. So the commitment to enhance teaching was kind of an embedded value that we were able to identify that we shared. Perhaps some challenges maybe, but also these are, depending on how you look at it, are a concern for transparency in decision making. The department really wants to know why we're making decisions that we're making and how we're going about making those decisions. So having these initial conversations helped folks to understand the goals, be involved in the goals, and also allowed them to demonstrate their concern about their autonomy in teaching. It's very vulnerable to have your teaching observed and reviewed. And so we were able to kind of respect that autonomy by bringing people into the conversations very early on in the process. Next, please. So now we'd like you to pause and take a moment and think about, in your particular unit, now that you've thought about sort of the culture in your unit, now we'd like you to think about how leadership, power, decision-making is distributed in your unit and how that might affect how you as a unit would develop a peer review of teaching process. What would have to be definitely considered or adapted or modified given the way that that's structured in your particular department.
Well, now that you've had a few moments to consider leadership and its distribution in your own departments, I want to take a moment to just briefly summarize what appeared on the Jamboard. And if you have a chance to look at it, you'll see these same kinds of trends. There were fewer responses at this particular point in our presentation during Innovate because of the technical difficulties we were having during the session. But it's interesting to me to reflect on these, to see a kind of commonality across the posts that are there, all of which speak to a kind of separation or hierarchy in some cases among the different tracks or categories of instructors within departments, and that kind of categorization is both challenging but also an opportunity to call into question the implications of those kinds of divisions. For example, associated faculty or lecturers, adjunct faculty that named differently at different institutions, in many cases are the faculty who have a heavier teaching load, but are also oftentimes have greater expertise in faculty. So there might be a disconnect in some departments between the power and the expertise that resides across those different categories. And these are just some of the ways power is distributed. Another that isn't really represented on the board, as you'll see, is also differentials between faculty and student status. And students are clearly stakeholders in the work of teaching and its subsequent learning in our departments. So to consider the role of students, and Jen, I think, mentioned that graduate students are part of the committee in EED. I think that's a critical step forward to include them as stakeholders and recognize that in some ways a power differential can be mitigated by including that particular constituency as part of the decision-making process.
Thank you, Kay. Lynn, can we have the next slide? Thank you. So we definitely, because we do have lecturers, associated faculty, practice faculty, and tenure track faculty, we wanted to identify and define a broad range of activities that would reflect those shared values, but also the needs of all the stakeholders in our department across teaching development and teaching evaluation. So we can't get around the fact that there are formal teaching evaluation requirements, for example, in your college level promotion and tenure faculty rules and guidance, of course. So we had to have a system that would allow for us to create robust letters of evaluation for our tenure track and faculty, practice faculty, but also something that would allow folks to authentically and genuinely get critical feedback that wouldn't put perhaps their promotion dossier in jeopardy. So we selected both formative review options, which were really focused on enhancement and development, but our process also funnels really nicely into those summative evaluations that are required. We produce documentation that allows faculty to write really robust and evidence-based letters for dossiers and promotion purposes. So as we were thinking about that, that was part of the rationale for those range of activities. And then we captured those, of course, in a formal policy document that we shared multiple versions of with our department to get feedback, bring in feedback on how to improve it, and then iterate on that as well. Throughout this whole process, we had really leaned on our organizational support from our university's Institute for Teaching and Learning, where Kay is coming from, as well as existing models of peer review and our department's beliefs and values around teaching. So all of these kind of had to come together in order for us to produce this policy. Once we had a policy, of course, we had to implement it. So first, next, please. As you're thinking about implementing, we would like you to now pause and for 3 minutes or so, think about what organizational support you might need in order to build, sustain a similar program like this in your particular organization.
And as I reflect for a few moments on the Jamboard responses from our live Innovate session, what becomes clear is that local organizational support is critically important. The chair and the relevant committees are often noted here, and those groups, those individuals and groups, really have to strongly support and also explain and advocate for the value to everyone across stakeholders, and especially among the faculty who are going to be so intimately involved in the work of the peer review. I would also add to the list of resources that are available. Your teaching and learning centers at your institutions. There are certainly there's other organizational support available outside of the department, and the Teaching and Learning Center is a critical one. We, in the Drake Institute, when we were partnering with engineering education, used as one of our primary resources for framing the work that we did with them and the collaboration that we undertook, the Palmer et al. Piece on measuring the promise, a learning-focused syllabus rubric. That was that document actually takes up more than just a syllabus rubric, but it really does speak to kind of the depth and breadth of engaging meaningfully in peer review of teaching within the kinds of contexts that Jen and Lynn and Anne have articulated for us today.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm thinking about our own implementation. We had to lean on many different types of resources in order to effectively implement our process. So just from a logistical perspective, we delivered and administered the implementation of our policy through several different technical modes that we had available to us. So a file storage system, which was Box, is now OneDrive or SharePoint. And the mechanism through which faculty were able to access and understand instructions, so they didn't have to just comb through a policy document, was done through our course learning management system, which is Canvas at Ohio State right now. And the screenshot that Lynn showed you at the beginning of the presentation with all the options is a screenshot from that Canvas. Of course, we also use email to communicate expectations at the beginning of each semester. We remind people that they have an obligation to complete a peer review of teaching option and provide instructions for them, as well as kind of driving them to the Canvas resource that we have. So that's just from a technical, logistical perspective. From an expertise / human supports that we leaned on heavily were coordination with teaching experts like Kay Halasek, who's here with us today, Melinda Rose DeSalvo from our Drake Institute for Teaching and Learning at Ohio State. We worked with them. They were wonderful. We met with them in advance to talk about what kind of training, what kind of resources and workshops would be helpful for faculty. And with them, we have so far delivered, I think, 3 different workshops. The first on how to conduct a classroom teaching observation supported by evidence-based practices in the moment, how to track behaviors and then use those behaviors and documentation of those behaviors to write a really compelling evidence-based letter of support for a faculty member. And then more recently to develop one on online course review and review of course materials and syllabi as well. And that's been really a vital way for us to show faculty we're not just making you do this thing and not giving you any supports or any strategies. We're bringing in training. We're bringing in experts who are going to help you make use of this in a way that's really going to be effective in helping you revise and enhance your teaching. We've launched all this past year. We've just finished our initial pilot year of this program. So Lynn, can you show them the next slide with all those different menu options? You can see here again our 17 different options. And one thing that we really like about, and I would like to highlight here, is that all of those activities that are kind of challenging and that we kind of ask sometimes maybe our more senior faculty to do, like observing the teaching of another teacher or being a model teacher, also are recognized as peer review of teaching activities here. And so that's another way that we're trying to sort of honor the needs of our stakeholders by not only having you be observed, for example, but also recognize the person who's doing the observing as also participating in that peer review of teaching process. And we'd like to show you one more, just a logistical kind of screenshot. Lynn, if you can show the next one. This is even drilled down further. So this is what you would see on our Canvas page if you were trying to complete the review of course materials option. So you can see we break it down with the short description, the evidence that we would like them to create, which is usually just a short reflection, and then the resources that we have available for them to complete it. If you can move to that last one, please, Lynn. So our last piece, of course, is we want to make sure that our program is doing what we want it to do. We want to make sure that it is, in fact, helping faculty, A, enhance their teaching, and B, feel like they're enhancing their teaching. A big part of this is not just actually making the teaching better, but helping the faculty understand what they can do and empower them to enhance their teaching and really feel that they're making a difference in the way that they teach. So we just gathered our initial assessment data. Actually, we're looking at that. A lot of folks are still participating primarily in the classroom teaching observation, which is very interesting. I think people were craving a really nice formal way of doing that, and I think the supports that Kay and Melinda have provided through the Drake Institute have really empowered people to feel that they're getting a lot more out of that experience. But we are going to reconvene in the fall to look at that in more granular detail and determine how we're going to change these processes as needed. I'd like to conclude today. We would have discussed with you now your individual unit. So we would like to, in closing, encourage you to think about your own departments, your own units. Begin having these conversations as much as you're able to, given where we are in the semester, given where we are in the year. But again, we really found that recognizing those stakeholder needs, thinking about the distribution of power in your department and in your unit, in your institution, and then also thinking about the culture that you're participating in, how those create openings, how those create challenges, and then finally, what are those organizational supports you need, and how can you start involving those folks that you will need their support early on in the process. So we want to thank you for your time today. We would welcome questions if you would like to communicate with us further about our process. But until then, thank you very much for your time.